Thanks for hanging in there and coming back for more. Sessions are going to be a little bit easier in sessions 5 and 6, and also I hope very interesting as well, because they are dealing with some really interesting topics, because our sessions until now have been spent explaining why the messianic concept is so central to Judaism, the way it fits in with God's plan for creation, etc. But in these final two classes, we're going to discuss the how and the who of this big Messiah idea. In other words, how does the Messianic age actually come about? And by what criteria will we know that the person who appears as a Mashiach is in fact the real deal? So tonight we're going to deal specifically with the how. So to begin with this, when people hear the word Mashiach or the Messianic era, what often comes to mind is something sort of out of this world, like a fairy tale scene in which we fall down some sort of Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole and everything dramatically changes, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in some glorious wonderland of some kind. But the question is that what's going to happen? So we have a number of texts over here, texts numbers 1 to 5, which seem to offer two very dissimilar portrayals of Mashiach's arrival. We're going to read through these texts, and then we're going to try and group them into the two kinds of groups that they seem to fall into. And so we're going to start on page 196 of your workbooks with text number 1. We'll follow through to text number 2. Text number 3 is on page 199, then page 200, 201, but just following through on all these texts one after the other. And if somebody would like to kick off by reading all of these texts at once, and then we'll discuss them afterwards. So who's going to go first for us tonight? The first volunteer is always the one that takes the longest.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do mine.
Okay, thank you so much. Right. Text number 1. Taken from the prophet Malachi.
Behold, I will send my angel, and he will clear a way before me. And suddenly, the God whom you seek will come to his temple.
Okay, the second text is taken from the great Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. And let's hear what he has to say in text number 2.
When a mortal monarch plans to return to his home, it is typical protocol for his arrival to be announced in advance. An initial announcement may give notice that he will arrive in 10 days, followed perhaps by a second advisory 5 days in advance, and then 4 days until the final proclamation the king is approaching the capital. The prophet Isaiah informed us that the Jewish redemption will not unfold in this manner. Rather, it will arrive in the blink of an eye, as he foretold. The first one to Zion, behold, here they are. And for Jerusalem, I will give a herald. In other words, Jerusalem's residents will not notice that all the tribes of Israel are converging on their city before the initial announcement is made by the first individual to reach Jerusalem, who will call out, "Look, here they all are, about to enter the city." It will be so sudden that the city's residents will not notice a thing before the reality materializes. The announcement and the event will come as one, hence the initial notice. For Jerusalem, I will give a herald. Will be, behold, here they are.
Thank you. Just before you go on to the next one, so I guess this happens every Sukkot and Pesach, when you have hordes of people arriving in Israel, and the poor residents of Jerusalem are not quite sure whether all these people descending upon their city are coming because it's Pesach and Sukkot, or because the Mashiach has arrived. It gets kind of confusing. But let's move on with text number 3. And this one is taken from the Zohar.
Well, when God will raise up the people of Israel and redeem them from this exile, he will open a small, thin ray of light for them. Thereafter, he will open another, far wider aperture. Finally, God will throw open the supernal gates that open to all 4 corners of the universe.
And text number 4.
The Jewish people of that generation will say, is it possible that the world functions as usual and nevertheless the redemption will arrive this year? However, they do not realize that the Mashiach's arrival will be sudden.
And finally, taken from the Jerusalem Talmud, text number 5.
Rabbi Chaya bar Abba and Rabbi Shimon ben Chalata once walked through the Arbel Valley and watched the break of dawn. Whereupon Rabbi Chaya told Rabbi Shimon, so will be the Jewish redemption. It will begin with small steps, as it is stated. Although I will sit in darkness, God will be a light to me. Then as it progresses, it will greatly swell and expand.
Okay, so the question over here is the redemption going to come swiftly and in a hurry and unexpectedly, in the blink of an eye, as one of our texts puts it, or is it something which is gradual? If you take a look on page 201, we've got a little chart, and we need to put these texts 1 to 5 in a category of either sudden or gradual. Just have a look at the texts again and decide which category they go into, just for a moment. Has anybody put them all into sudden? Or has anybody put them all into gradual? Well, the problem is... Sorry?
Text number 4 is sudden.
Yes. What would you say about text number 1?
I think it's gradual because it says clear away before me, so that's progression, and suddenly the God whom you seek will come to his temple. So it's in 2 stages, gradual then sudden.
Okay. And anyone else?
I've ticked sudden for that one because obviously it refers to the word sudden.
Yes, yes. Okay. And what would you say about... carry on, please.
Number 2 is a blink of an eye.
Yeah, so that's sudden. Okay.
Okay, sudden.
Okay. What about text number 3?
That's gradual.
Okay. And what do you say about text number 5?
Gradual.
Okay. So here we are. Of these 5 sources, texts numbers 1, 2, and 4 indicate that the process will be sudden and supernatural. And by contrast, there are many other sources which include text numbers 3 and 5 that indicate the other way around. The Mashiach will come gradually in an organic or in a natural fashion. So Jews can't make up their minds, can they? We just don't know where we are. As I've said on one previous occasion, the reason why we have the same word for hello as goodbye is shalom, is because half the time we don't know whether we're coming or going. And the same thing seems to apply to the Mashiach over here. But the key really to understanding this discrepancy lies in a particular prophecy regarding the Messianic era and along with its Talmudic interpretation. So I'm going to read this for you. This is text number 6a on page 20, and then I'm going to read you text number 6b. Text number 6a is taken, of course, from the book of Isaiah, and he writes as follows. I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew first, because there are 2 key words over here that are going to be important. Hakaton yeh elef, the smallest will become 1,000. V'hatzair, and the smallest, Lagoy Atzum, will become a great nation, a mighty nation. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. This is a prophecy about the Messianic era. And then the 2 key words, Be'itah Achishena, I will hasten it in its time. Be'itah Achishena. Achishena means hasten. Be'itah means in its time. Now, here is what the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin it says about this verse over here. The same verse that states that the redemption will arrive in its time, which seems to imply at an appropriate time when it's ready, also states that I will hasten it, I'll make it come quickly. So is there a set time for the redemption or not? And the Talmud then resolves the seeming contradiction in the words of Isaiah by saying that if the Jewish nation merit it, then achishena, then I will hasten it. And if they don't merit it, then be'ito, then I will come in its appropriate time. So here's the resolution to our contradiction over here. If you do it the right way, if everybody's ready for it, it can happen quickly. If we're not ready for it, it's going to take time and there's going to be a process. So there really are these two options. One is dubbed in its time and the other one is dubbed hastily. And with this we understand that these texts are in fact a very neat kind of binary. If Jews are meritorious, redemption comes in a hasty, sudden manner. If redemption is not, if we're not ready for it, it's a gradual process which describes the other verses. But it's really important to understand over here that either option is actually possible, and that we need to continue to believe in both forms in order to be able to have a solid foundation for belief in Mashiach. Because if one is only aware of the possibility of the suddenly option, then it would be very hard for us to imagine or to believe that anything is already underway or that Mashiach is any closer today than he was 1,000 years ago. It's going to happen suddenly. It doesn't require any preparation. But hey, what about all the work that we've done over all the centuries? Hasn't it helped to refine the world? Hasn't it helped to bring Mashiach closer? Are we not in a long-term process? But by the same token, if you assume that Mashiach can only be a gradual process, then we'll be disbelieving that something drastic can happen that can shake things up. And we'll simply say, no, well, that's just a superstition. So one really needs to have a balanced belief in both approaches. And what's more, to a certain extent, it actually is both. Because redemption is a process that has been going on since the beginning of time, as we've spoken about in the previous lessons. But the culmination of this process can happen very suddenly, very instantaneously. And in our prayers on a daily basis, that's exactly what we pray for. Now we're going to take a very slight detour because we're going to talk for a moment about Elijah, who we'll come back to in our last lesson, the sixth of our session next week. But the last of the biblical prophets was Malachi. And the very last prophecy that he makes, the last sentence of the last book of the last prophet, is a text about Elijah. And it is on page 203. It's a one-liner again. And it reads as follows. It's text number 7. Hine anochi shalech lachem et Eliyahu hanavi lifnei bo yom Hashem. It is actually the last line of the Haftarah that we read on Shabbat HaGadol in Shul. I will send Elijah the prophet to you before the arrival of the day of God. This is the basis of Elijah being the harbinger of the Mashiach. So Elijah the prophet flourishes in northern Israel in the 8th century before the Common Era. Is one of the most famous and the most beloved of our prophets. And the book of Kings reports about his death, and it is miraculous. The story is that, watched by his faithful disciple Elisha, who's going to take over from him, he ascends to heaven in body. He is the one person in the whole Bible who doesn't actually die, or at least there's no description of his death. He goes up to heaven in a bodily form. And there's no parallel at all in the biblical narrative anyway, not Moses or anybody else. And Malachi, the prophet Malachi, tells us that Elijah is going to return before the arrival of the day of God, which Jewish tradition has for a very long time understood as referring to the Messianic era. So what is Elijah's function? Well, there are a number of answers that are provided, and you'll see them either in figure 5.1 on page 204, or you can also see them in our slide. And I need to just take us through a couple of slides over here because I missed out the slide on sudden or gradual. And this now brings us to Elijah. So the first thing that he does is that he announces Mashiach's imminent arrival. He inspires Israel to better their ways. He restores prophecy. He answers some unresolved halachic queries that nobody's been able to figure out throughout the thousands of years that we've been poring over the Talmud. And he restores the Sanhedrin. It couldn't come sooner. Without a Sanhedrin, we're all over the place. Jewry is completely divided. Every Beth Din makes its own decisions. We've got Jews who are halachically Jewish in one place and not halachically Jewish when they land somewhere else, and then halachically Jewish when they travel onwards. It's a complete mess. Sanhedrin controlled the whole uniform body of Judaism. Either way, the name of Elijah has become synonymous with redemption. And of course, one very interesting place to see this is in the illustrated Passover Haggadot throughout all the ages. And here is an example of one such Haggadah. I'll just take myself out the picture so that you can see this one a little larger. And can you see that in this picture over here from this illustrated Haggadah, here is Elijah blowing the shofar of redemption. And here is the King Mashiach arriving on his donkey. And in that respect, this is Shvach Chamatcha Al Goyim. This is the moment at which we go to the door and we open it for Elijah. And all the children wait to see it. And when they come back in again, they look at the cup of wine to see whether any of it is missing. And if you are a really sneaky parent who's into fooling their kids, while the kids are at the door, you pour out half the cup and wait for them to come back. We've never done that. Okay. That's as much as we want to say about Elijah for the moment. But we're just bookmarking it now because, as I say, we'll come back to it next week. Let's talk for a moment about the profile of the Mashiach. So Maimonides, who we always turn to because he is the authoritative halachic description and nobody disagrees with him in these matters, his description of the Messianic, which we'll read later on in the lesson, clearly speaks of a real live person whose arrival we must believe in and for whom we must wait. A person will arrive on the scene and put the new era in motion. And Reb Chaim Vital, remember that he is the one who takes all the teachings of the great Kabbalist Arizal and writes them down, because the Arizal, Yitzchak Luria, didn't write anything himself, but Chaim Vital is the faithful scribe, and he writes in this one line, which I shall read. It's text number 8 on page 206, and it says as follows: King Mashiach will certainly be a righteous human born of a man and a woman. So no kidding about that. He's not some kind of spiritual angel. He is a flesh and blood human being. Let's take a look at some of his qualities, which are as they're described in classic Jewish literature. And here we're going to read a midrash, which is your text number 9 on page 207. I'll read it for you. Behold, my servant will succeed. He will be exalted and elevated, and he will reach tremendous heights, says Isaiah. Says the Midrash in commentary on this verse of Isaiah, this is a reference to King Mashiach, who will be exalted over Abraham, elevated higher even than Moses, and he will reach tremendous heights, higher and greater even than the angels. Well, that's some heck of a CV, isn't it? Not a bad start for him. Following along these lines, Maimonides describes the Mashiach as the ultimate prophet, king, and teacher. Text number 10 on page 208. Taken now from Maimonides, the King Mashiach will arise from David's descendants, so he is a direct descendant of King David, who will be wiser than Solomon and a great prophet close to the level of Moses, even though we've just learnt that he's going to be greater than Moses. He will therefore teach the entire nation and instruct them in the path of God, and all the nations will come to hear his words. We'll have this tremendous wisdom, just by the way, as people came to Solomon from all over the world, including the Queen of Sheba, who was completely smitten by Solomon's wisdom, even though at the time he was a young man. Well, as if that's not enough, we learn that there's even more about the Mashiach. He has exceptional humility together with all this incredible greatness. And that is our text number 11 on page 209. This is taken from the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Reb Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson. Mashiach's uniqueness will be his humility, despite reaching the pinnacle of greatness, due to which he will teach Torah to the patriarchs and to Moses. He will teach Torah to Moses. He will nevertheless achieve the ultimate in humility and self-nullification, due to which he will also be able to teach the simplest folks. So there's no arrogance there, and as a consequence, he doesn't consider himself to be in the intellectual camp, dealing only with the cleverest and the brightest. He deals also with the simplest of folks. Well, we can go on and on from other sources, fishing for more qualities to add to this incredible CV, and the list does indeed go on and on. But is there one single quality that this oil all boils down to? In other words, is there a single feature or characteristic about the Mashiach from which all of these other qualities flow? Some kind of unifying principle that makes all the other qualities fall into place? Well, first of all, let's take a look at this slide over here, which says that the King Mashiach will be a human being, and there is his certificate of live birth. This slide over here, which also tells us the King Mashiach is going to be the greatest and the wisest, which we've already discovered. So let's come back to this question over here. Is there a single unifying quality? And for this, we turn to what at the time was really considered to be a groundbreaking talk and insight from the Lubavitcher Rebbe that sought to identify this one single unifying quality. But before we can understand this piece of teaching from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we need a bit of background information, and it's something about our souls. There's a passage in the Midrash that notes that in the Torah, the soul seems to be referred to with 5 different names. And the Kabbalah and subsequently Hasidic teachings explain that the 5 names actually indicate 5 distinct levels of each person's neshama, of each person's soul. Of course, we use the word neshama as a generic for the whole soul, but there are 5 parts of the soul, all making up the component parts of this entity that we call a person's souls. And here you'll see this in figure number 5.3 on page 210, or alternatively, we can see it here on this next slide. And once again, because it's quite small, I'll take myself out of the picture so that we can see this larger over here. Are you able to see this on your screens? I hope so. So the first level of soul is called nefesh. The English translation is vitality, and its primary faculty is biological life, the physical life of a person. That's the part of our souls that vivifies us, keeps us alive, keeps the body working. Then there's another part which is called a ruach, which we translate as spirit. And that is the emotional dimension that is built into every human being. It's that part of the soul that drives our emotions. Then the next is that generic term which we call neshama, which we translate as soul. And that is the intellectual dimension that human beings have the capacity to think, to understand, to comprehend. And that is why the generic name for soul is neshama, because that's the thing which defines us really as human beings, our intellects and our brains and our capacity to understand. And then there is a level which is called chaya, a higher level which is called life. So there are numerous layers to our self or to our identity. There is the self that defines itself and lives its life purely in physical terms, which is driven by biological urges and instincts. There's the emotional self that defines its own life and its relationship with its surroundings by the world of feelings and emotions. There is the intellectual self that sees and experiences everything through the lens of reason and intellect. And then there is the self that is driven by faith, our most deeply held convictions, the truth that we know, not because they're proven to us or because they've been rationally explained to us, but because we know these truths with the soul's innate capacity for faith, its capacity to recognize the deepest truths about itself and about existence. But that's only the fourth level, because there's something higher even than that. Finally, there's the highest, most essential, absolute core of the soul, and that is called the Yechidah. The word Yachid means alone, the oneness of the soul, the point at which it is deeply, profoundly connected with God. And by the way, just for your information, on Yom Kippur, there are 5 services during the course of the day, during the course of Yom Kippur, starting with Mariv, Shachrit, Musaf, Mincha, Mariv, and then Ne'ilah. And they take you through the 5 levels of the soul, and one of the reasons why Ne'ilah is so incredibly profound and why it touches people so deeply is because it is in Ne'ilah that we're able once a year to access and to feel and to sense the Yechidah of our souls, that sense of incredible togetherness in the present with the Almighty in the congregation at that moment. And that is the Yechidah. Okay, now we're ready to understand this insight of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in text number 12 on page 211. Now, once again, it's put in terms which are, quite deep. I'll read it just to try and make sense of it, and then we shall, of course, as always, explain it as well. Says the Rebbe in this particular book or talk, Mashiach's fundamental quality is that he is the collective Yechidah of the entire Jewish nation. For the mystics reveal that King David merited the collective soul dimension of Nefesh, Elijah merited the Ruach, Moses, of course, who was intellect, was Neshama, Adam was Chaya, and Mashiach will be Yechidah. Of the 5 dimensions that each soul possesses, the lower 4, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, and Chaya, are individual rungs with particular features and functions, as we have just explained. But by contrast, the Yechidah is the soul's singular, indivisible core. And just as this is true regarding each individual soul, its very essence is the Yechidah, the same is true of the life force of all creation. The life force itself has a Yechidah, and that is the very essence of the divine energy that causes it to exist. And this Yechidah is abstract, defying every qualification or form. From this Yechidah, all the individualized branches of divine energy necessary for creation emerge. And now, Mashiach is associated with this collective Yechidah of all creation. And this essential core energy is absolutely unlimited, not only in quantity, but in quality as well. It is entirely perfect and complete. And therefore, when this energy manifests itself in this world through Mashiach, everything will therefore function at the highest and at the most perfect level. He is the collective Yechidah of the Jewish nation. And Mashiach soul embodies this Yechidah, and this special soul will descend into him. So, at a certain point in time, going back a moment. So the Yechidah is not limited to one particular dimension of power or the human experience. It's, as we've explained, the deepest part of the soul. It's limitless, it's external, it's the very essence of the soul's being. And the Kabbalah therefore teaches further that just as every person possesses an individual soul, as we read in this piece, creation as a whole also possesses a divine life force and a soul, also comprised of these 5 dimensions. And that's what King Solomon taught when he said, God placed the world within the human heart, meaning to say the human being is in fact a microcosm of the universe. We share in our souls the same structure that the universe has within it as well, the DNA of the spiritual universe, so to speak, these 5 levels. And Mashiach's soul is the embodiment of the very essence of the collective soul of all of creation. So at a certain point in time, the person who is destined to be the Mashiach, who is a human being, as we've learnt, will experience a personal transformation similar to the one that was experienced by Moses in his life, the first Redeemer of the Jewish people, and the Mashiach is the last Redeemer. To date, Moses, of course, is the greatest prophet and leader that our nation has seen. But remember this, that for the first 8 decades of his life, until he was a man of 80, Moses himself was completely unaware of his eventual historical role in the last 40 years of his life, from the age of 80 to 120. So, by the way, any of you who are thinking of retiring because you're reaching close to 80, just remember, you could be Mashiach and it could be starting soon now. So hang in there. Don't give up just yet. Only when Moses chanced upon God in the burning bush was he then endowed at that moment with the power to become Moses, the Moses of record that we all know about. And so it will be in relation to the Mashiach as well, and that is our text number 13 on page 213. I guess it's once again from Maimonides, but time for somebody else to read. Any volunteers?
I'll read.
Thank you.
Moses, the first Redeemer, reached the age of 80 years with no knowledge or intuition about his eventual role as the Redeemer of Israel. So will it be, God willing, with a future Redeemer.
Okay, sorry, I cut you off. Please carry on.
When the time comes, God will appear to him, and then the spirit of Mashiach, that until that moment was hidden on high, will descend upon him, similar to the experience of Moses at the burning bush. Okay,
hang in there, Ruth, because I'm going to ask you to read text number 14 in a moment. So the question now is this. Here is this incredible person, and something transformative happens in his life. I'm presuming that he's a man. Nobody has actually touched on the point of whether Mashiach could actually be a woman, but let's not go there tonight, okay? But an interesting question nevertheless. So this man suddenly discovers that he is the Mashiach. He has this transformative experience. And so I wake up tomorrow morning and I have an epiphany in my life. And I suddenly have this intense, incredible, crazy feeling that I have encountered God and that I'm Mashiach. And I am going to start to shout out loud, first of all to our little group of onliners in the morning and to the morning minyan, hey guys, I've got great news for you today. You wouldn't believe this, but it's happened. I am Mashiach. Isn't that great? How are they going to believe me? What are they going to say? I know what they're going to say. I know who they're going to call. Somebody comes along and puts you into one of those straitjackets and takes you away for a long time. As a matter of fact, by the way, I actually had this experience in yeshiva when one of the boys, a Baal Teshuva, somebody who was a returnee, an American, suddenly actually had this incredible breakdown and started to scream and shout all over the place in the dining room, as it happened, that he was Mashiach, and he was taken off to a psychiatric hospital, and we visited him there. I don't know what happened to him. I lost contact, etc. But these things happen. And by the way, if you go to Jerusalem, you'll find all kinds of crazies who believe that they're Mashiach. Most times they'll be hanging around the wall and they'll be asking you for some money as well. But it's all right, I'm Mashiach. Yeah. So if somebody comes along tomorrow and claims to be Mashiach, how do we know whether he is the real thing? You know, you can't have a kind of Kabbalistic MRI scan, to see whether he has all the qualities. So how are we to know if a given individual is or is not Mashiach? One thing I didn't do was I didn't set another recording, which I need to do. New recording, I think it's got to be. Oh, maybe I'm already recording. That's fine, okay. So Maimonides comes to the rescue once again, and he sets out a very defined and rigid set of markers to identify the Mashiach. And the halachic text that we're about to read now, that Ruth will continue to read for us in text number 14, is undisputed by all major Jewish halachic authorities. Okay, Ruth, text number 14, page 214 in your workbooks.
When a king from the house of David will arise, who, like his ancestor David, diligently studies the Torah and observes his mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, influences all of Israel to walk in the way of the Torah, rectifies the breaches in its observance, and wages God's battles, this person is presumed to the Mashiach. If he succeeds in the above, and he builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, he is certainly the Mashiach.
So fascinatingly, Maimonides over here sets out two stages in identifying Mashiach in this text over here. Stage number one is what he calls presumed Mashiach. And stage number two is confirmed Mashiach. And there are a number of criteria for each stage, which you can see in your workbooks on figure number 5.4 on page 215, or alternatively, once again, in this slide. And again, let me take myself out of the picture for a moment so that, having lost my cursor, here it is. Remove spotlight. Okay. So here we are. These are the stages of presumed Mashiach. Okay. Number one, he has to be a descendant of King David, direct linear line. Number two, he has to be supremely pious and well versed in Torah. Number three, he has to influence the Jewish nation to follow in the ways of Torah. And number four, he has to wage God's battles. Not made clear by Maimonides whether he means physical battles, wars in other words, or whether he means the battles for the spirit and for the ideas and for the ideals. Now, these qualities and actions, these four, confer upon this person the status of presumed Mashiach. And the reason why it's only presumed is because the latter two items over here, i.e. influencing the Jewish nation to follow in the ways of the Torah and waging God's battles, are really work in progress. They don't happen immediately, and whether these waging of battles are actual or ideological, they just don't take a single day. So while this presumed Mashiach is in the throes of this campaign, so long as he is meeting with success, so long as he is doing these things, we are to assume that he is indeed the Mashiach, and we are to throw our weight behind him. Although the jury is still out as to whether he will prove to be the real thing, as we'll see, because he has not yet done the last two items on our list, which is going to make him the confirmed Mashiach. So the next stage then is when the Mashiach proves that he is indeed here to stay. And there are two big items on the list, which are below the line on our screen. And these are the things which confirm the Mashiach, still once again in figure 5.4 or on the screen. The confirmed Mashiach, as opposed to the presumed Mashiach, must oversee the ingathering of the Jewish people, in other words, everybody going to Israel, and he has to build the third temple, which is only a very small problem at the moment, because there's another building standing there at the moment which is getting in the way. And how that's going to be removed and make way is going to have to be up to this man called the Mashiach. And if this presumed Mashiach can see the campaign all the way through to the end, then we know that he is the Mashiach. And the end in this context consists of very, very identifiable benchmarks. He has to bring the entire Jewish people together in the land of Israel. He has to build the third temple. If those things haven't happened, he is not the actual Mashiach. Now, we have another thing to say about the Mashiach. There's one born in every generation. One bulb is always ready to light up. Every generation has a potential Mashiach waiting in the wings, although it can well be that the world and the people in the world will not be ready in his lifetime, and therefore he will die, and it will have been a missed opportunity. But the notion that in every generation there's one specific person who is indeed a candidate for the job traces its way back to the following Talmudic tale, which describes the time of the destruction of the temple. And it's a fascinating little piece of text, a very enigmatic one. It's text number 15 on page 217, and it reads as follows. A man was ploughing his field when his ox suddenly lowed. Loud. What is it? Loud? Don't know how to say it. Maybe I shouldn't have been the one to read this. Somebody who knows how to pronounce the word should have read it. An Arab passer-by inquired, "What is your nationality?" "I'm a Jew," the ploughman replied. "Untie your ox," the Arab advised, "and unharness your plough," because this was considered a sign of mourning. Why? Because the Jewish Holy Temple has just been destroyed. What is your source for this information? The Jew demanded. I deciphered it from the sound of your ox lowing, replied the Arab. As they were talking, the ox suddenly lowed once more. "Harness your ox and retie the plough," the Arab exclaimed. "The Jewish Redeemer has just been born." So what we see in this extraordinary passage, which has been widely commented on, about how there's an Arab who can read the sounds of an ox and all kinds of stuff that's going on over here. But the essence of it is that the Talmudic passage seems to be indicating the Mashiach was born immediately after the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. And a literal reading of this story would lead one to conclude that today Mashiach must be nearly 2,000 years old. But that's not the way we read it. Of course, what the commentators are really saying about this is that this story is teaching us the important idea that as soon as the temple was destroyed, there was someone born who could have been the Mashiach, and that so too in our times there is somebody around who is the candidate for the job, even though he himself may not know it, or almost certainly doesn't know it. And if he does know it, he's probably a little bit meshuggah. So there's this candidate waiting in the wings, waiting for the people to do their part so the Spirit of God can descend upon him and enable him to bring about the redemption. And the very famed commentator on the Mishnah, Rabbi Ovadia Bar Tanura, expressed this idea in a one-liner, which is your text number 16a on page 218. And he said as follows: in every generation, a descendant of Judah is born who is a befitting candidate to be the Jewish Mashiach. I bet none of you knew this, that there's a Mashiach in every generation, that there's somebody around who could be the Mashiach, or the presumed Mashiach. So based on everything we've learnt above, that the Mashiach can indeed come at any moment, it's obvious that there must be someone who can step in and put things in motion. And if we are really to believe that Mashiach can come at any moment, it follows that the person who will or can be Mashiach is alive, he is available, and most importantly, he already possesses the physical and the spiritual qualities to do the job. And while he may not yet have waged any war or begun the process of building the temple, he certainly has to have the personal traits of piety, Davidic lineage, Torah erudition. All the first three qualities of those four qualities have to be in place. He has to be teaching, he has to be waging the wars, he might be presumed. And it also only makes sense that the potential candidate also already possesses or demonstrates some certain leadership qualities. Because if you have a pious, erudite person with Davidic lineage who's already leading the Jewish people with a powerful religious influence, it stands to reason that he is going to be the best candidate for the presumption of being Mashiach. And that's the reason why throughout all of Jewish history, students of various influential Jewish leaders have looked to their rabbi as the potential Mashiach, because they've seen someone who has the piety, the energy, the Davidic line, the teaching, the engagement, all the qualities for the presumed Mashiach. So, and by the way, this next section that we're going to be looking at over here in these quotations helps us to understand parts of I suppose, what has been the elephant in the room during this course, trying to understand why it was that Chabad Hasidim believed that the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory was the Mashiach. Was this an aberration? Was this something completely out of context? Was this the first time something like this had ever happened in history? Or was this part of normative Jewish behavior based upon these texts that we've been learning? Take a look at text number 17 on page 219. It's really quite fascinating. What is the Mashiach's name? Asks the Talmud, which is a nice question. The scholars of Rabbi Shiller's academy would say his name is Shiloh. Rabbi Shiller's academy, his name is Shiloh. In other words, their rabbi is the candidate, because it stated, the scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes. In other words, our rabbi, until he comes, and all the nations will rally to him. The scholars of Rabbi Yanai's academy say, no, his name is Yinon, from Yanai. It's our rabbi, because it is stated, may his name endure forever for as long as the sun, and may his name continue Yinon. And that's the name of our rabbi. The scholars of Rabbi Hanina's academy would say, his name is Hanina, it's our rabbi who's the presumed Mashiach. As it is stated, for during your exiles, I will show you no Chanina, no favor. And our rabbi's name is Rabbi Chanina. And some scholars insisted that his name is Menachem, which, by the way, happened to have been the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Menachem, the son of Chizkiyahu, as is stated, because of the time of the destruction, the comforter, the Menachem, that should relieve my soul, is far from me. And Rabbi Nachman stated, if the Messiah is among the living, he is a person who already occupies a government position, such as me. So he wanted to claim the kudos. As it is stated, their prince shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from their midst, Jeremiah. And Rav stated, if the Messiah is amongst those currently alive, he is the holy Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And if the Mashiach is among the dead, he is Daniel, the prophet, Daniel the beloved, known as the Yedid. So you see from this text over here extraordinarily that in those Talmudic generations, the students of each of the academies vied to argue that their rabbi was the candidate for the job because he had the right name, and presumably some of the other qualities as well. And we find also in text number 18 that the practice of identifying potential Mashiachs lasted well beyond the Talmudic times. So here we have a statement from a very well-known rabbi who wrote a book called the Sdei Chemed on page 221 in text number 18, which reads as follows. In each generation, people would assume that a particular individual was the Mashiach if the redemption were to occur at that time. In his generation, it was declared and accepted that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was a suitable candidate to serve as the Mashiach. And similarly, the students of the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, in the 15th century, wrote that he was the Mashiach of his generation. And all of this is a straightforward matter. In other words, we don't have to even be surprised about it. No surprise that students will look at their rabbi and say, this is the man who can do it because we are his followers and we see all of his great qualities. The important thing, however, is that he has to tick all of the boxes. No redemption is considered to be underway until it checks all of the halachic boxes. Redemption doesn't begin until we are certain that the Mashiach is here. No redemption is even considered underway until it checks all of the halachic boxes. To prematurely declare that Mashiach is here is considered to be halachically illegitimate, and it has only caused catastrophic results for the Jewish people, as we'll see in a couple of examples shortly. On the other hand, it is not problematic at all to suggest that we are in the process of the preparatory stages of redemption, or to point to or to identify an individual as the potential Mashiach, or even if he fits the bill, the presumed Mashiach, because those are the early stages. But you can't go any further than that. The authors of our course wanted to offer an analogy from marriage. I'm always very careful to offer analogies from marriage, but I'll offer you this one just because they've put it in. There's courtship, engagement, the beginning of the wedding, which is breaking plates, signing contracts, and all of these steps bring the marriage much closer to reality, but you're not considered husband and wife until a singular, definable moment when the man slips the ring on the woman's finger. And exactly the same thing applies to Mashiach. There can be many preparatory steps that hail his arrival or presume his arrival, but he is not considered here until all of the critical steps above, including leading all the Jews back to Israel and rebuilding the temple, until they have all been met and performed. Well, now, aside from the potential Mashiach in every generation, there have actually been a number of various attempts in history at actual messianic campaigns. namely people who claimed to the Mashiach and who actually took active steps to validate their claim. And there have been many such attempts, some which are better known than others. And we're going to examine two particularly famous ones and focus on the contrast between them. So we're going to start with the famous story of Bar Kokhba, also known as Bar Koziba, who led a rebellion against the Roman occupiers in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And to date, he is arguably our nation's best attempt to find a messianic candidate. I'm going to show you this video. Having had to reset this up again, I hope that this sound is on. If not, I will start it again.
From its inception, the Jewish nation lived with a messianic vision. Even in the worst of times, the Jews anticipated the rise of their star, a savior from the tribe of Judah who would liberate them from foreign subservience and enable religious freedom. 2,000 years ago, Rome stretched forth its mighty branches. In 6 of the Common Era, Judea, the heart of the Jewish homeland, became a Roman province. A few decades later, in the wake of the Great Jewish Revolt, the Romans destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. That marked the onset of the Jewish nation's exile and persecution. At the same time, the Jews could now anticipate their liberation through the promised Jewish Messiah. In 117 CE, Hadrian became Roman emperor. He toured the empire, erecting pagan temples and promoting Roman beliefs. When he reached ruined Jerusalem in the year 130, he ordered the city plowed over and rebuilt as a Roman city named Aelia Capitolina, with a temple to Jupiter, the chief Roman deity, erected on the site of the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. This was more than the Jews could take, and in 132 CE, a major revolt began unlike any other. The rebels assaulted the Roman garrison stationed in Judea and succeeded in capturing and holding part of the territory. As Jews from the diaspora flocked to join the cause, Hadrian responded by sending massive reinforcements from Syria, Egypt, and Arabia, but these were similarly defeated. Rome was badly shaken. Hadrian realized the need to muster a truly enormous army in response. He summoned legions from across the globe, including his best general, Julius Severus, who was ordered to travel from Britain with 3 European legions, and units were dispatched from as far as the Danube. Nearly 1/3 of the colossal Roman army was redirected to counter the Jewish revolt. The Jewish army was led by Bar Kokhba, about whom we know precious little.
The name Bar Kokhba wasn't really the man's name. We actually know his name was Shimon Bar Koziba. But he was called Bar Kokhba because of a biblical verse in the book of Numbers, Darach Kochav Yaakov become Shevet Yisrael, that a star will come forth from Jacob and a staff will arise from Israel. And this verse was understood to refer to the Messiah. As far as we know, many Jews believed that Bar Kokhba was indeed the Messiah and that they were supporting the coming of the Messiah in participating in the revolt.
Such views were reinforced by Bar Kokhba's military gains and his liberation of Jerusalem.
What's really amazing is that during the period of Bar Kokhba's rule, he put out coins. On the back side of some of these coins was actually the words Elazar Kohen, Elazar, the high priest, apparently. And this may indicate that they tried to restart sacrifices.
Despite Bar Kokhba's widespread support, the Jewish sages were sharply divided on whether Bar Kokhba was the Messiah.
There were different views among the very important rabbis that we know from the Mishnah. Rabbi Akiva was convinced that Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. The Jerusalem Talmud actually records him as saying, "This is the King Messiah." At the same time, others, like Yochanan ben Torta, were convinced that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah. And he told Rabbi Akiva, the grass will be growing on your nose, meaning you'll be in the grave before this guy will ever be a Messiah.
Eventually, the tide turned. the legions launched a campaign of systematic annihilation that left Judea almost entirely depopulated. The Roman historian Dio Cassius writes, very few of them in fact survived. 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their villages were razed to the ground. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire were past finding out. Bar Kokhba withdrew into the fortress town of Beitar. It was besieged and fell in 135 CE, ending the revolt. Its occupants were slaughtered in an enormous massacre on the 9th of Av, the date in the Hebrew calendar on which the first and second temple had been destroyed. Bar Kokhba died there, and Hadrian bitterly oppressed the Jews and the Jewish practice in retaliation.
Some years ago, I was at a scholarly conference about the Bar Kokhba revolt, and an Israeli archaeologist mentioned they had actually already located over 500 of these villages. I imagine that by now, you probably found a lot more. So here we see that these events really occurred, and that this war and this tragedy was as great as we find in our sources.
In the ensuing 2 millennia of Jewish exile, the Jews, unlike the Romans, survived and thrived, returned and rebuilt, and continue to eagerly await the fulfillment of God's promise of redemption.
Fascinating story. So the campaign of Bar Kokhba concluded with tragedy and heartbreak. And the sages equated the fall of Beitar, which, as we heard, happened on the 9th of Av, with the destruction of the Holy Temple, which occurred on the same date. But the revolt had started off with much promise, and as we heard, many of the greatest Jews of the time believed that the redemption was at hand, and that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach. And that brings us to text number 19 on page 222 in your workbooks. Rabbi Akiva was a phenomenal sage among the great sages of the Mishneh era. This is Maimonides. He personally served as King Bar Koziba's arms bearer and would proclaim that Bar Koziba was the King Messiah. Along with all the sages of his generation, he considered Bar Koziba to be the King Mashiach until Bar Koziba was killed because of his sins. Well, fascinating stories about what his sins were, but that will take us beyond where we want to be tonight. So, Rabbi Akiva, of course, is one of the greatest of our sages, one of the central pillars of the transmission of Torah tradition. Was he mistaken? Did he simply fall for a charismatic charlatan? How can it be that he supported someone who was apparently a fake? And the simplest answer to that question is that Rabbi Akiva wasn't mistaken at all. At the time that he threw his support behind Bar Kokhba, Bar Kokhba was completely legitimate. He was at the stage of presumed Mashiach, a candidate who was carrying out the messianic campaign and who sees success. And as the halacha tells us, at that point one is obligated to support this person. And Rabbi Akiva identified in Bar Kokhba the qualities and the behaviors of the presumed Mashiach, and therefore he lent him his support. And in the end, things did not work out for Bar Kokhba, and so he wasn't the Messiah. He never moved from presumed to confirmed. When Bar Kokhba's campaign fell apart, what set Bar Kokhba's failed campaign apart from many of the other false Mashiachs that have risen over the last 2,000 years, who also only brought grief and heartbreak to the persecuted populace, is that for a while it was a perfectly legitimate run. For a while Bar Kokhba checked off all those boxes of presumed Mashiach. And Maimonides writes about him, if he succeeds in the above and builds the temple in its place and gathers the dispersed of Israel, then he is certainly the Mashiach. And if he did not succeed to this degree or was killed, he is surely not the Redeemer promised by the Torah. Rather, he is like all other worthy kings of the Davidic dynasty who died. And as such, Bar Kokhba wasn't a false Mashiach, he was a failed Mashiach. And that's the great contrast between him and the other famous false Mashiach, Shabbatai Tzvi, much further down in history, all the way to the 17th century, where we encounter this colossal fiasco of Shabbatai Tzvi. Let's tell the story. Shabbatai Tzvi was born in 1626 in the city that today is known as Izmir in Turkey. He was a very handsome and a very charismatic man who at a young age mastered an enormous amount of Talmud and Kabbalah and gained a tremendous following of disciples. In 1648, still a relatively young man, 22, he declared himself Mashiach. And over the following years, he lived in Constantinople, Alexandria, Athens, and Jerusalem, among other places, and he gained a huge following, and many, many Jews believed that Shabbatai Tzvi would imminently usher in the redemption. As opposed to Bar Kokhba, he was a false Mashiach, because he never passed muster from the outset. Because while his campaign whipped up intense fervor and support, he very quickly was able to demonstrate that he didn't even pass the halachic litmus test. First of all, he violated many of the halachic norms, which was an immediate no-no for someone claiming to be Mashiach. And Maimonides has already said that he must observe the mitzvot, all the mitzvot as prescribed in the written and the oral law. By the way, one of the things that he did that was a big no-no was that he began to pronounce the ineffable name of God in public. You know, the names that we use for God is not the real name. We don't pronounce the real name. And by the way, we don't know how to pronounce the real name, because when we see it written with a yud and a hey and a vav and then a final hey, we don't pronounce the word the way it's written. Instead, we simply use a nickname when we come across that word. And the Kohanim in the temple would recite God's name, but they would say it in such a way that there's noise all around and nobody would hear it aloud, because it was too sanctified to pass on to the population. And he violated that to start with, and that immediately got all the rabbis' backs up, although there were some who were supportive of him. So his messianic campaign ended in a spectacularly tragic way, because in 1666 he converted to Islam. And even after his death in 1676, at the age of 50, many continued to believe that he was the Mashiach. Well, one has to understand the context within which he was able to sweep the stage across the world and to create this incredible following. At that particular time, Jewish circumstances were absolutely dismal. It was the aftermath of these horrific pogroms known as the Khmelnytsky pogroms of 1648 and 1649, when tens of thousands of Jews were massacred and huge numbers were dispossessed and displaced. And as a consequence, Messianic hope was at its absolute peak, and it seemed to Jews as if Mashiach was just about the only way out. You know, one has to have compassion for Jews who grab onto the strings of hope, you know, the ones that were offered by this man who turned out to be a charlatan. Well, there's a lot of discussion about Shabbatai Tzvi and, you know, his personality, and some people want to say that he suffered from some form of mental illness. Some people say that he manifested symptoms of manic depressive psychosis, and you know that with manic depressives, that when they are high, they really can fly and can be hugely attractive, charismatic, energetic, and everything else. And as a consequence, there were many Jewish leaders of the time who recognized this, recognized, you know, this flaw in him, and they vehemently denounced his campaign. The point is of all of this is that we actually have a very practical legal framework to identify who the real Mashiach is and exactly what he will do. And if we stick to that framework, then things work out. And so this is the point about these two cases that we've looked at. There's Bar Kochba and Shabtai Tzvi, and the one is a failed Mashiach, and the other one is a false Mashiach. Well, coming towards the end of our talk tonight, let's unpack this, let's look at this a little bit more carefully. We've established who Mashiach is, what he'll do, and how he's going to go about it. But let's continue down the Messianic timeline and try and explore what the Mashiach's role will be once his initial campaigns have proven to be successful, once the wars have been fought, once the temple has been built, once the Jews have returned to the land and everything's humming along nicely. What happens to this man then? What does he do? What's left for him to do? What's his job? Has he worked himself out of a job? So, to unpack this question, we'll look a little bit further. Because as we've said many times in this course, the Messianic era is all about realizing the primordial dream of creating a home for God in this physical world. And as we explained last week in Lesson 4, this home can't be superimposed upon the people. It has to be the result of our own efforts and choice, which we said ad idiom many times last week. So the question then is, how is King Mashiach's role, Mashiach as king, compatible with that? Because a king evokes the imagery of subjects who are bending to the will of the monarch. The king is the lawmaker. He is the enforcer. But if the Messianic era will be marked as the time when God's presence will be fully realized on earth and everything will naturally be in sync with his will, who needs a king under those circumstances? So our understanding is that at a certain point in time, the Mashiach's role will transition, or perhaps mature, from the practical revolutionary, the organizer of the revolution, to becoming an inspiring teacher to sustain or to bask in that revolution. In more traditional legal terms, he transitions from being a melech, a king, to a nasi, to a religious leader. So the whole king idea will in relative terms, fade away. Mashiach's primary role after that period will be that of a teacher and a mentor to his people. And we see that in king and organizer of revolution in the early stages, and when he has finally succeeded, he is an inspiring teacher and a religious mentor. Well, before we look at our final video, our summary video, let me tell you where we're going to be, what we're going to do next week in the climax of this course. Because we're going to be tackling some of the burning questions that still swirl around the topic of redemption, just in case we thought that we'd exhausted every possible avenue over the last 5 weeks. There's still some questions which we haven't discussed, such as, who will the redemption redeem? Only Jews? Gentiles? The rest of the world? Hey, how about the animals? What will a post-redemption world look like? Will the dead be reincarnated at that stage? What will happen to the 10 lost tribes? Are they going to reappear? And are we going to discover that they were all Ethiopians? Why do we need Elijah the prophet, who we learned tonight as the herald to the arrival of the redemption? And when we talk about the Mashiach waging wars, are there going to be apocalyptic events that coincide with the onset of the redemption? Well, if we've been able to hold your interest for the last 5 sessions, hang in there for the 6th one next week. But for the moment, here is our concluding video for tonight.
Lesson 5. Out of the Blues. 1. Isaiah describes 2 options for the redemption: in its time and hastily. If we are meritorious, the redemption will arrive earlier and in a sudden and abrupt manner. If not, the redemption will come in its default time, and it will unfold as a gradual process. 2. Malachi prophesies that Elijah the prophet will return before the arrival of the day of God, before the coming of Mashiach. Chief among his duties will be to announce the imminence of Mashiach's arrival. 3. Mashiach will be a mortal who will possess incredible qualities and will achieve tremendous spiritual heights. On top of that, he will be exceedingly humble. The Kabbalists reveal that Mashiach's soul will embody the essence of the collective soul, the Yechida, of all of creation. 4. Maimonides outlines 2 stages in identifying Mashiach. A. Presumed Mashiach, and B. Confirmed Mashiach. A descendant of King David who is pious and versed in Torah influences the Jewish nation to follow the Torah's ways and wages God's battles is presumed to be Mashiach. If he gathers the Jews to the land of Israel and builds the 3rd Holy Temple, he is the confirmed Mashiach. 5. Each generation has a potential Mashiach. Throughout history, students of various influential Jewish spiritual leaders have pointed to their leader as the potential Mashiach. However, the redemption has not begun until Mashiach successfully completes the tasks of the confirmed Mashiach. 6. There have been various historical attempts at actual messianic campaigns. 2 particularly famous attempts are Bar Kokhba and Shabbatai Tzvi, with the distinction that Bar Kokhba was a failed potential Mashiach, whereas Shabbatai Tzvi was a false Mashiach. 7. At a certain point, Mashiach's role will transition or mature from king to primarily that of an inspiring teacher and religious mentor.
Okay, well, there you are.